What's the next phase of the war and peace process in Central America? On March 2, 1988, Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT, spoke on this question at the Northwestern University campus, sponsored by the Evanston Committee on Central America. Chomsky is the author of numerous books and articles on international affairs and is an expert on Central American politics. Here are excerpts from that speech.
What I wanted to do was focus attention on the coming phase of the conflict, now well over a century old, between the United States and essentially the population of Central America. That's been an ongoing war, an unequal war. The victims are all over there, and there are many of them. It entered a new phase in the 1980s, and it entered another phase beginning on February 3rd. Change in the character of this war, and I do want to focus on this coming phase. February 3rd I pick because that was the day in which the Congress, responding to substantial popular dissidents, imposed certain limits on the what the World Court called the unlawful use of force by the United States in its attack against Nicaragua. I'll come back to the background and details of that, but let me mention that February 3rd is also opens a new phase in another war that's been going on at the same time, and that's a war between our government and its population. Now, that's not unusual. Typically, states regard the general population as an enemy. That's normal. The task and role of the population is to be apathetic, obedient, passive. If it's what's called a democracy, they're supposed to show up every once in a while to ratify elite decisions. But if they get involved in anything beyond that, they're causing trouble, and they have to be controlled, and they're an enemy. Now, among elite groups, there's variation. There are tactical variations, and the Reagan administration happens to be at a rather extreme end of a spectrum, but it's not, the spectrum hasn't changed. It's the old spectrum. They just happen to be extremists within that spectrum, and their fear and hostility of the general population is also extreme. Also, they happen to be pretty open and frank about it, so they tell you if you bother to listen. One of the first things that the Reagan administration did back in the early 80s was to establish within the State Department an institution called the Office for Public Diplomacy, which had the task of controlling public debate and discussion, setting the framework for discussion. So it carried out operations like what they called Operation Truth, which is one that Orwell would have loved, and it had about as much relation to truth as you would expect something to have with that title. It was exposed, all of this was exposed more or less last summer by one of the few reporters who actually gave serious coverage to the Iran-Contra hearings. By that I mean didn't just pick up the release that was handed out, but actually bothered to look up the documents. Alfonso Chardy of the Miami Herald, back around July or August or so, he did a study of documents that had been released about the Office for Public Diplomacy, and he went to members of the Reagan administration, high administration officials, and asked them to explain, account for all of this, and they were quite frank and happy about it. They described this brainwashing operation as one of their most spectacular successes, and one which is correct if you think about elite opinion, was very successful in setting the discussion and debate about Central America, Nicaragua in particular. In fact, one high administration official described these operations to Chardy as the kind of operations you would carry out in enemy territory. Now, that's a telling and accurate phrase. From the point of view of the administration, the population is enemy territory, and the people are inhabitants of enemy territory, and if you can't control them by force, you got to control them by propaganda. Now, again, that's not a position that's unique to this administration. It's a standard position. I go into it later if you like. It's long articulated in our history, back to the origins of our society, and it's very typical of other societies as well. But the Reagan administration is at an extreme point. And they were very proud of their successes in the war that they conducted in enemy territory at home, that is the ideological war. If you can't control the population by force, and you can't even control it by by propaganda, the state faces a dilemma. And there's about only one thing they can do in that case, and that is to go underground. And in fact, that's just what happened during the 1980s. Operation Truth worked very well. The Office of Public Diplomacy succeeded very well among elites who basically agreed with the policies anyhow, but it didn't work very well among the general population. In fact, it worked very badly. The population is more dissident and active today than any time in the last generation, contrary to what you often hear. There's not much articulation of this because the elites don't reflect it. And Congress is only a very weak reflection of it. The media, virtually no reflection at all. But in the general population, there's plenty of activism and dissidence, and you can tell it. And the Reagan administration learned it very quickly. They were very quickly driven underground. They were driven underground by the opposition, the inhabitants of enemy territory, who were not going to tolerate the actions that they intended to carry out. Now, clandestine activities in any state are a pretty fair measure of the level of popular dissidence. Open violence, overt terrorism and aggression are far more efficient than clandestine terrorism. They just work a lot better. And furthermore, they don't bear the risk of exposure, which sort of causes all kinds of problems when it occasionally happens. So when a state turns to clandestine terrorism, clandestine violence, it's because it's forced to, and it's forced to by its own population. Clandestine activities are not a secret from anybody else. What are called covert operations are obviously not a secret to the victims. The kinds of operations that were, and also take, say, the operations that were partially exposed during the Iran-Contra hearings, plainly they weren't a secret to the victims. They weren't a secret to the mercenary states who were enlisted in the cause. They weren't a secret to shady businessmen like Richard Secord and the rest out to make a buck. In fact, they weren't even a secret to Congress and the press, if you want to know the truth. They were just at a low enough level so they could be suppressed. The only people that they were secret from was enemy population, the enemy territory at home. There they were a secret. The general population didn't know about them. And that's the point of clandestine operations. Clandestine operations are always, in part, a war against the domestic enemy. And when a state carries out extensive clandestine operations, it's very much afraid of its domestic enemy. And that's what happened in the 1980s. During the period August to January, August 87 to January 88, the Reagan administration, Congress, and the media, so elites generally, had a certain task. Their task was to demolish the Guatemala City Accords, to which they were opposed. The Accords were unacceptable to Washington, therefore they had to go. Well, how do you do it? Let me first notice that there were a number of features of the Accords which were completely unacceptable in Washington. The central feature of the Accords was the simultaneity feature. If you look at the way the Accords were structured, they were based on the idea that a number of things have to happen simultaneously in the various countries and so on. Now that's unacceptable to the United States for two reasons. For one thing, the simultaneity requirement would place barriers in the way of the United States' attack against Nicaragua, and that's obviously unacceptable because the United States intends to continue the attack in one way or another. So that's out. And on that, there's an elite consensus. There's no debate over this in the media or in Congress, with very marginal exceptions. The simultaneity condition has to go. The Accords must be interpreted so that they apply to Nicaragua and Nicaragua alone. That's what that means. And that was done very effectively. There have been a number of studies of the media that give the exact numbers, but anybody who's been reading the papers or watching the tube knows the story. The idea that there have to be a number of things happening at once is unacceptable because it would place barriers to the U.S. attack. And since that's unacceptable, simultaneity condition, which is the core of the Accords, has to go. There's another reason why the simultaneity condition is unacceptable. It would place barriers on the U.S. attack against the populations of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Because the Accords call for measures to preserve liberty and security and freedom and access to free expression and so on and so forth, a whole range of measures which are completely unacceptable to the United States and cannot possibly be carried out unless without structural changes in those countries that would eliminate the whole security apparatus, which was designed with the support of the United States in the case of Guatemala and Honduras, and developed and imposed by the United States in the case of El Salvador, designed precisely for the purpose of preventing that to happen. It was designed for the purpose of traumatizing, repressing, torturing and killing, if necessary, the domestic population, so that they won't cause any problems anymore. Those are the kinds of states where you don't worry about propaganda. You go after the jugular if people start to open their mouths. And that's what we did down there. And plainly, those measures cannot be stopped. There's no way for the Accords to apply to the U.S. terror states. It's inconceivable. They have to undergo a radical internal transformation. So therefore, the simultaneity requirement is unacceptable for that reason alone. Now, let me stress again that there's an elite consensus on this. For example, say, take the matter of freedom of the press. You'll notice that there has been no debate in the United States, no discussion in the United States during this phase of the Accords on freedom of the press, say, in El Salvador. In fact, what we hear is they already have freedom of the press. And in a certain technical sense, that's true. That is, there's no law in El Salvador which says you can't have an independent newspaper. You don't need a law. There was an independent press in El Salvador in 1980 when the United States moved in to turn it into a Nazi-style terror state. There was a free press. In fact, there were two independent newspapers, not leftist or anything like that, mainstream independent newspapers, La Crónica and El Independiente. Well, they're not around any longer. In the case of, they were never censored because we hate censorship. In the case of one of those newspapers, what happened is that the U.S.-run security forces surrounded the office with tanks, destroyed it, drove the editor out of the country with assassination threats after several assassination attempts. That took care of one of them. In the case of the other one, our security forces, they're our forces, remember, our security forces picked up the editor and another journalist in a restaurant in San Salvador, took them outside, cut them to pieces with a machete, and left them in a ditch somewhere, or the rest of them. That took care of the second newspaper. So there's no more problem of freedom of the press in El Salvador, and you'll notice that none of these sudden libertarians who are so concerned about freedom of the press have called for a reopening of an independent press in El Salvador. Nobody's ever heard the words La Crónica and El Independiente. You hear about La Prensa, including many lies, but nobody hears about freedom. And of course, nothing remotely like this ever happened in Nicaragua. But you never hear a word about freedom of the press in El Salvador. In fact, these events these two newspapers, to be precise, there were 3 references to what I've just described in the entire 1980s in the New York Times. So you can't claim that we don't have a free press here. But it was so, if you're really a scholar and you got a terrific memory, you can remember that something unpleasant happened there, but it's certainly not an issue. We don't look into the question. Nobody calls for freedom of the press in El Salvador, and for 2 very good reasons. For one thing, Washington, the Office of Public Diplomacy, has ordered us that topic is off the agenda. We're not supposed to talk about that, so therefore, being loyal cowards, we naturally obey, so that's one reason. The other reason is that to call for a free press in El Salvador would be ridiculous. You can't have a free press in El Salvador without first dismantling the whole terror system that the United States installed precisely to ensure that you can't have things like a free press, or for that matter, Bible study groups that might turn into peasant self-help groups, and in fact, all the developments that caused Washington to unleash the terror apparatus. So since it's absurd to ask for a free press, I guess there's no point in doing so. In any event, no one asks about it. Meanwhile, I should say in Nicaragua, nothing remotely comparable has happened. The opposition claims harassment, and of course it always hits the front pages of the newspapers, but they're not expecting to be murdered or tortured. And this opposition is extreme. It's the kind of opposition which has never survived in a Western democracy in times of crisis. La Prensa, for example, and the groups around it are openly support the U.S. attack against Nicaragua. Nothing secret about it. I just had I'm not sure it's happy experience, but experience of reading 3 months' worth of La Prensa. I must be the only person outside the CIA who actually has all of La Prensa since the time was opened in my office at home. And it's just openly pro-Contra. It doesn't even hide it. It's simply a U.S. government disinformation organ. I mean, to allow the journal to publish, it's as if in the United States during the Second World War, the media were largely dominated by Japanese fascist journals calling for the overthrow of the U.S. government and the liberation of the territories in the Pacific from the racist murderers in the United States or something like that. I mean, such things are inconceivable. They never happen in the West. And the same is true of what we call the opposition, which openly identifies with the U.S. attack against Nicaragua and regards the U.S. as their only basic political support. Well, they do get harassed, and they get censored and that sort of thing. They don't get murdered. In El Salvador, there's nothing even remotely similar. It's not like the press knows all of this, but will never report any of it. Inconceivable that they report these things, though every journalist in Managua and San Salvador knows it. Again, nobody is talking about the application of the terms of the Accords, which would permit an opposition, even a mild opposition, to function. Nobody's talking about those conditions. In El Salvador, that's off the agenda. And in general, all the simultaneity requirements are unacceptable because they would require the dismantling of the terror apparatus that the United States took such pains to impose and still supports. Now, another feature of the Accords that's unacceptable was international verification. The Accords had in them a provision for verification, an international verification commission, which included the 5 Central American countries, the Latin American democracies, the Contadora countries, the OAS, the Organization of American States, and the United Nations. Well, plainly that's unacceptable, essentially for the reasons I just mentioned. International verification would put barriers in the way of the U.S. attack against Nicaragua and the U.S. attack against the populations of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras via the terrorist apparatus, the military regimes, which were either imposed or supported for that purpose. So that's unacceptable. Another reason why international verification is unacceptable to the United States is that the Latin American countries, though dependent, of course, on the United States, after all, we are the 800-pound gorilla, they're dependent on the United States, and there are limits beyond which they can go. Nevertheless, they have a degree of independence. They have a degree of independence, and therefore they're not allowed in at all. In fact, nobody with a degree of independence from the master of the hemisphere is allowed in. So plainly, international verification has to go. And in fact, the demolition job on the Accords was completed by January. By January, the simultaneity condition was thrown out, international verification was terminated, and in fact, nothing remains of the Accords. They are finished. They are part of ancient history. Nothing remains of the Guatemala City Accords. The press may talk about the Arias Accords and so on, but either they're lying consciously or else they're unwilling to bother to look. The fact of the matter is there is nothing left of those accords. What is left is a version of the accords written in Washington and transmitted by the press and accepted by Congress, and that version says Nicaragua has to accede to arbitrary demands stated by the United States government, whatever they happen to be. That's the accords. And that's all there is left of them. There's nothing left of the original text. Well, what were the means used to destroy the Accords? This is a very successful demolition job. What were the means used? Well, there were two kinds. There were military means and there were ideological means, you might say. The military means were, first of all, and most important, the intensification of the CIA supply flights. That was the most important event that happened during August to January. As I mentioned, the supply flights, which of course illegal to start with, were sharply intensified to about 2 to 3 a day, and also U.S. surveillance flights, which we have a very extensive surveillance apparatus, all the fanciest SR-71s and U-2s and satellites and spy ships off the coast and so on, are carrying out intensive surveillance of Nicaragua, and that was extended too. Now, both of those operations are significant. The supply flights are crucial, in fact critical, because, as is recognized on all sides of this debate, the Contras, the proxy army, are not guerrillas. They have no remote relation to guerrillas. The KGB doesn't fly 2 to 3 supply flights a day into El Salvador to keep the guerrillas in the field. And nobody's talking about sending humanitarian aid to the guerrillas. You don't have to, because they're part of the country. They're rooted in the country. They fight inside their own country. They've got their own network of support. In fact, the reason for U.S. terror in El Salvador has been to try to destroy that base of support. But they don't need supplies. They don't have to get, but the Contras, on the other hand, have to get everything from food to fancy communication equipment to boots to arms and so on, because they're not part of the country. They're a foreign implant. That's what it means to say. In fact, nobody really denies this is not a topic for debate. You know, the Reagan administration is the first ones to tell you that this force is going to collapse unless we continue to provide them with arms and supplies. The meaning of that, which they don't bother to tell you in the press, but you can figure it out, the meaning of that is they're not guerrillas, because nobody does this for guerrillas. And in fact, that's written into the Accords. It's well understood in Central America. You take a look at the actual wording of the Accords, and they say that the indispensable element for peace in the region is an end to any form of support. And then they mention military, logistical, propaganda, or whatever, to two kinds of groups, namely irregular forces and insurrectionist movements. Now, the distinction for that is that the irregular forces are the Contras, foreign organized forces attacking some country. The insurrectionist movements are indigenous guerrillas. And the indispensable element of the Accords is the termination of any form of support for them, any form, logistical or whatever. Of course, as a corollary, the use of one country as a territory for insurrectionist movement, for irregular forces attacking another. In January, the International Commission, the Verification Commission, published its report. Now, that was plainly the most important thing that happened in January. Here's this commission made up of the 5 Central American countries and the Latin American democracies and OAS and the UN, had investigated all the countries. They finally came out with a report. Now we can finally get an independent, objective assessment of the compliance with the Guatemala City Accords. Well, it was mentioned in the New York Times. We have a free press. It got actually one sentence in the New York Times, buried in an article by James Lemoyne, in which he stated that the commission broke up in disagreement. Well, in fact, its report was unanimously accepted, but that was the total description in the news report on January 14th, when 15th, the report was issued on the 14th. Here and there you could find, the Chicago Tribune actually covered it in this case, but there was very little coverage. And you can see why. The conclusions of the commission were just not useful for ideological warfare. Why? Well, first of all, the commission denounced the United States. It singled out the United States and the United States alone for condemnation because the United States had undermined the indispensable element for peace in the region by continuing its support for the irregular forces attacking Nicaragua from Honduras, and in fact from Costa Rica. And that's the central condemnation in the Accords. Well, plainly that's useless. Now, the commission went on to say that they couldn't provide detailed comments on the particular countries of the region, and the reason for that was that 3 countries objected: El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The 3 U.S. terror states would not permit a description. You can figure out for yourselves what the description would have been, but the U.S. wouldn't allow it. Through its clients, it blocked any description of the... however, they did have a press conference in Costa Rica, and there the delegates discussed, the Latin American representatives spoke openly at the press conferences of what they called, they said that they were shocked by the attitude of patent fear in the faces of opposition people and trade unionists in El Salvador and Guatemala, the 2 U.S. terror states. Well, plainly there's no point in reporting that. The commission also praised Nicaragua for what they called concrete steps towards democratization despite the ongoing U.S. aggression. Well, that's plainly useless. In fact, none of this is useful for ideological warfare, so therefore it didn't happen. And the reporting is virtually zero in the New York Times, which is the most important newspaper. Worse than zero, 1 sentence which was a lie. The commission plainly had to be disbanded, and the U.S. simply insisted that it be disbanded. The main U.S. client in the region, Jose Napoleon Duarte, who is a Democrat by definition because he follows U.S. orders, is also one of the worst murderers in the history of Latin America, and he's reviled and detested throughout Latin America for this region, but here he's very highly praised. He said with some insight, I think, that it wasn't really necessary to have an international commission of verification because he said the press would suffice for verification. That's quite right. That expresses a real insight into the workings of the press. Well, that took care of the International Verification Commission, so one element of the Accords, the basic element of the Accords, is gone, no more international supervision. Recognizing that the powerful make the rules and the weak just obey, Nicaraguan President Ortega then announced that Nicaragua would adhere to the conditions of the Accords alone.
A lot happened between the time of the speech by Noam Chomsky on the 3rd of March 1988 until about the 3rd of April when this videotape was made. March 1st, the Contras attacked a Nicaraguan village. March 2nd, the Republican Contra aid plan was voted down. The next day, talks between the Nicaraguan government and Mosquito Indians began. On March 4th, the Democratic Contra aid plan was voted down. 2 days later, there was an investigation of misuse of American funds in El Salvador. March 9th, negotiations between the Sandinistas and the Contras were canceled. The next day, the Contras released a captured American. The day after that, the Contras agreed with talks with Nicaragua. March 12th, Robert McFarland pled guilty to withholding Contra information from Congress. On the 15th, the Senate voted to force the president to inform them about covert operations. The next day, the Costa Rican president opposed Contra aid. Then the Big Four was indicted for conspiracy. The U.S. sent troops to the Honduran border, saying that Nicaragua had invaded, which Nicaragua denied. The next day, the troops did arrive from the United States, and the following day, Oliver North resigned. Duarte in El Salvador almost lost control of the National Assembly. The American troops moved within 15 miles of Nicaragua, and the Nicaraguan Contra talks reconvened. On the 24th, temporary truce between the Nicaraguans and the Contras was ironed out. All the heavies pleaded not guilty in the Contragate affair. March 28th, Nicaragua freed the prisoners under the ceasefire agreement, and the next day the negotiations began. On the 30th, Congress approved more Contra aid. April 1st, the ceasefire began in Nicaragua. The next day, the U.S. sent 1,300 troops to Panama. As of March 27th, 25,000 people have been killed in this American-sponsored Contra war against Nicaragua.